Hello and welcome back to another episode of Armchair Analysts, the only podcast trying to invest in Martin Braithwaite's real estate business. My name is Cameron McDonald, and I've spent 3 years working as an FA licensed intermediary here in the UK. My co-host Rupert Meadows has written and broadcasted about all things football on platforms such as TalkSport Radio and Give Me Sport. But above all else, we're fans.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cam. A joyous and historic mood in this week's episode as England make the final of a major tournament for the first time since 1966. Beating Denmark 2-1 in extra time, they will meet Italy, who themselves dispatched Spain on penalties, at Wembley on Sunday. As always, timestamps are in the description, and before we get into what we can expect in the final, let's take a look at how the semis played out.
Let's indeed. I mean, obviously, last we left listeners off was in the quarterfinal preview. Since then, we had the quarterfinals and the semi-finals. So let's look at the semis, and if relevant, we'll reference the quarterfinals and how they sort of influenced this. But England versus Denmark is a good place to start, as we are both England fans, and because it was a really, really interesting game. It was sort of, in a sense, a microcosm of England's entire tournament, and in another sense, it had a lot of elements that we didn't really see before. The big one, of course, being England conceded, and not only did they concede, but they had to come from behind, which is one of those moments. Again, we talked about this last time we talked about England's games. I sort of had to watch it and then watch it again, because at the moment I was sort of not really watching it with an analytical mind. You know, when we were sort of knocking the ball around as we were closing the game out, and everyone was sort of going, "Oh, you love to see it, like England controlling a game." I was not enjoying that. I was not enjoying that at all. I was on the edge of my seat just sweating. I was like, "Stop!"
It's that moment where you're like, "Don't change anything. This is working. Don't stop what you're doing. Don't try and do something different." And then that's where you worry that something's going to change. But you got to give them credit, because that was probably the best closing out of a game that I've seen England do in maybe ever.
It was fantastic, but it was, I think David Mitchell of Peep Show fame has a very funny bit, not in Peep Show, but one of his sort of things. He talks about like retroactively enjoying sporting moments, and he talks about, I think he uses the example of like an Andy Murray final when he won Wimbledon, and he was like, at the time, I really didn't enjoy it because it was a nail-biting, like, back and forth, and obviously I wanted Murray to win, so I wasn't enjoying the final at all because it was, like, on the knife edge, he could lose at any moment. Retroactively, I look back at it and I go, oh, wow, what a fantastic final, right up to the wire. And it was kind of the same thing with this closing out of the game. At the time, I was not having a good time with all the passing around, because I was sort of, like, in my mind's eye, seeing, like, Calvin Phillips misplace a pass and one of the Danes running through a goal. Retroactively, once the final whistle blew, I was allowing myself to go, okay, that was actually really good.
I mean, did you not get that payoff when the whistle blew?
I did, yeah. Once the game had been finalised, I was like, okay. But like the whole time it was happening, and like everyone else in the pub was going like, way, every time the ball was passing, and I was like, don't tempt fate, you fools.
This ain't gonna work for me. Yeah, to be fair, I kind of know what you mean. I mean, I think that the way that the period of extra time went, I was feeling pretty confident at that point in England's ability to hold on, because Denmark really just looked like they were flagging fatigue-wise, and we were just all over them. So I was feeling a little calmer at that point, but I definitely got the same vibes as you. But before we move into kind of how extra time played out, let's just talk about how, I guess, the game progressed. And I kind of feel like it was, in some ways, as you say, the epitome of our tournament, but also I always think of it as a bit of a vindication of our tournament, because some of the tactics that we've maybe questioned, like Kane dropping into midfield or staying wide versus playing narrow, we've actually handled pretty well.
I think it's one of those things, isn't it? It's like, it seems like a really stupidly obvious and sort of almost pointless thing to say, but tactics are bad until they win a game. If that's the best way to say that, you know what I mean? A lot of people have sort of been saying like, oh, it's funny how like the British public at the same time are able to consider Gareth Southgate as eligible for sacking if he loses to Denmark or to Ukraine, but if he wins the Euros, he should get a knighthood. Like, it's amazing that you can swing from one to the other so wildly. And that's kind of the thing. I think with Gareth Southgate's football, a lot of the time this tournament, it has been either sort of closing out the game that sort of had me on the edge of my seat, or sort of football that's maybe not the most exciting in the world, and starting two defensive midfielders and looking to be very conservative, that on looking at the 11, you sort of go, oh, but then when the final whistle goes, you go, well, you know what, it was worth it. It's what I imagine it must be like supporting a Jose Mourinho side a lot of the time. Like if you're a Chelsea fan or sort of the more successful ones, not so much Manchester United, because I think that was sort of where things started to crumble. But like if you were supporting Chelsea in one of those like Mourinho part of the bus years, I'm sure if you're a Chelsea fan, in a lot of those games you were sat there just going like, oh, this is a bit dross, isn't it? But then when you win the league at the end of the season, you go, hey!
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, that's a good example with the defensive midfielders because that's more quote unquote negative football. But definitely some of the braver tactics, like the fact that apparently no one's told Kane to stay on the defenders when he's playing up front. You just look at and you think it's bizarre, and in that sense, I don't know, it kind of feels like more of a Panenka penalty. Like it's you look like a complete idiot if it doesn't work, but if it does, then you're the hero.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I've maintained throughout, I think up to this semi-final, really. I think now you can kind of say, but I've always sort of been a bit jury's out on Gareth Southgate. I think the semi-final of the World Cup was a great achievement, but there were the sort of criticisms to be levied against it in terms of like the strength of the teams we played. I think the fact that, we lost, I spoke about this when we talked about the previews, but like the fact that we lost the game to Croatia because we were a little bit too cautious and the moment got to us and we started pulling attacking players off. But, we've beaten some really, really good sides to get to this final. And even if we don't win in the final against Italy, although for what it's worth, I think we will, that is a fantastic achievement and he's done it in back-to-back tournaments. I think he's really cast off the shadow of doubt. And I don't think, the stat that everyone's been going on about is that he's England's most successful manager since Alf Ramsey. I don't think he's anywhere near that level just yet. But you know what? If he wins the Euros and goes on to be successful in the next World Cup, there's nothing stopping him.
He's getting it. Yeah, it's funny because I feel like it's definitely been from my opinion at least, it's definitely been a tale of two tournaments. Because in the first half of the tournament, up until we played Germany, we weren't playing positive football. We weren't looking great. We didn't look like a cohesive unit. We were winning games, yes, but not in an encouraging, exciting way, in a way that you kind of thought as soon as we came up against a team that had it all together, we were really going to come unstuck. And then after that Germany game, I kind of felt like we've almost shrugged off the ghost of Christmas past. We beat the demons back. We actually managed to conquer Germany in like a competitive match. And since then, we've just been a completely different outfit. We won 4-0 against Ukraine and looked exceptional. And then this 2-1 against Denmark again, we really looked like we deserved the win. And the statistics all back up those facts.
Yeah, England played like the better team for the majority of the game. I think Denmark were a little bit threatening early on and obviously got that fantastic free kick goal. But for the majority of the game, it was England's game. And I think although the score of 2-1 might not reflect that, anyone who's watched that game, I think unless you're particularly salty about it and you're an anti-England or pro-Denmark fan, will think, we'll get onto the sort of the penalty talk later and how the nature of the win was a little bit controversial. But I think ultimately England did deserve that game.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to spend too long talking about the controversy of the penalty because you've seen them given, you've seen them not given, and Denmark also had a moment during their free kick that could be questioned and legally probably shouldn't technically have standed. So,
well, let's crack on with the penalty in its own bit when we get into sort of deeper into extra time. Let's look at sort of how the game and some of the earlier stuff. So one of the things I really wanted to focus on about England in this game and in the tournament in general is how interesting the use of rotation has been in this tournament. Obviously, we've seen sort of Calvin Phillips and Declan Rice start pretty like every single game and be mainstays. But outside of them, there has been, Harry Kane and Raheem Sterling as well, but outside of them, there's been a lot more sort of flexibility. Obviously, we've seen all these wing positions from Saka to Sancho to Grealish, Mount coming back in here, the centre-backs, the full-backs. It's all been rotated really well, and I think that that's been really good from both a tactical standpoint, obviously the main example being Germany, where I think we got it absolutely correct in doubling up sort of wing-backs onto Robin Gosens and the things that brought us, but also in terms of how energised the team looks at this point in the tournament. Like, it was very apparent, especially in extra time against Denmark, that they were run ragged. They were absolutely out of stamina. They were doing the best they could, but it was one of those games, a lot like Spain versus Croatia, where it's very apparent that one team has sort of used their squad to its full extent, which I think England have an advantage on because it is a very, very deep squad with a lot of quality. But I think a lot of managers at the tournament have sort of stuck with an 11 really and just sort of gone with that just throughout the entire tournament. And I think actually, interestingly, it could be something that gives England a little bit of an advantage over Italy. They've had a little bit of change, obviously between Chiesa and Berardi, and the midfield with Verratti coming back in and Spinazzola now through injury. But other than that, it's more or less been all the same players. And if the final, this is the culmination of the whole tournament, it could be a little advantage for England. So I just sort of wanted to single that out. I think Southgate's use of rotation has been fantastic. And the fact that you think of Phil Foden, who was so good against Croatia, one of the best players, although that wasn't a very high bar against Scotland, but against Scotland, and he's not played since then, he's not started since then, it's sort of just another player waiting in the wings. Saka is a question mark, Sancho is a question mark, because of course he's now signed for Manchester United and is thus eligible to play for England, apparently. But yeah, there's loads of decisions. Obviously, Mason Mount's come back in. He offers a very different sort of suite of skills to Jack Grealish, but both they can play together. There's just so much option in how he can approach this, and all of these players, as well as offering sort of different things that you can take advantage of against whoever the opponent is. They're just all more well rested, which I think is really, really good and showed against Denmark.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think. I mean, of any side, Italy have used the most amount of players. I think only one player, their third choice goalkeeper, is the only one who hasn't taken to the pitch. Obviously, quite a few of them have been cameos, but I would say after England, Italy are probably the second or third best team at doing a little bit of rotation. But I definitely agree with you.
I think there's a difference between rotation, though. Because I think there's a difference between, because it's true Italy have started pretty much everyone, played pretty much everyone, but a lot of it has been like last minute subs so that everyone can get a foot on the pitch, because that's Mancini's whole thing. Their starting 11s have been pretty consistent.
Yeah, there was one game in the group stages where they did quite a solid amount of rotation, but apart from that, it's mostly been...
against Wales when it was done.
Yeah, it's mostly been a pretty set group of players, you are correct. But I think that it's a really important point about England, and... For example, when we discuss tactics, I think Germany's quite a good example. We were kind of talking about the strengths, the pros and cons of fully adapting tactically to the opponent versus trying to play your own game, sticking to what you're good at, and what each of those things brings. And I think that Southgate found quite a nice balance between those two, because when we talked about the tactics that he could have used against Germany, we imagined a very drastic shift. Both in style and in personnel. And Southgate took on some of those things. He moved to 3 at the back, for example, and adopted a couple of the tactics that we talked about would be necessary, like doubling up on Gosens, for example. But he also, crucially, didn't make all of those changes. And it wasn't a completely different England. And I think that you've got to give him credit for being able to maintain momentum and maintain the style of play while kind of tactically shifting to match the opponent.
Yeah, definitely have. And I think we've seen that Germany was sort of the first example we saw of that. Not because, obviously Croatia and Scotland and the Czech Republic are all challengers in their own right, but sort of the first quote-unquote big challenge that England had this tournament was against Germany, and so we came up with a different 11 against that, and then we shifted back to a back 4 against Ukraine and won that game obviously at a counter, and then changed back again. Obviously it was only Saka for Sancho, but that was a huge thing against Marler coming down the left. So just understanding, keeping the core values that he obviously has in terms of team building, but changing the right players. And that's what we said at the very start of the tournament before a ball had even been kicked. We sort of both talked about how England's biggest strength was their ability to tailor the team to the opponent. And I think we both worried that Gareth Southgate wasn't going to be bold enough to do it. And to his credit, he has been.
I definitely feel like I have a renewed sense of respect for Southgate, as I'm sure everyone does. I don't think that's a fresh take. But yeah, I'm very happy to be being proved wrong game in, game out by my criticism of him of games gone by.
Yeah, and, obviously if we lose in the final, he's back to just being shit, but we'll be extremely reactionary.
We represent the fickle majority.
Speaking of subs, though, instead of rotations, I thought Denmark made some really, really odd changes in this game. I thought Mikkel Damsgaard was by far their most dangerous player in the first half, and bringing him off to bring on Yusuf Poulsen, who then went on to do basically nothing that game, and sort of wasn't really dynamic. He also didn't have Kasper Dolberg up front either, so they sort of took off their 2 most dangerous attacking players and sort of let England sort of ease into the game. I did kind of feel like that's where the game, obviously it was 1-1 and it then did go to extra time, but that was the point at which it felt like England just took full control of the game. I think they made a triple sub. I think their right wing back, Larson, also came off. It was a real weird trio of subs. And maybe part of that was what we were just talking about, sort of a lot of players being knackered. But I just thought, and then the camera kept panning to Damsgaard to sort of underscore my thoughts as I was sat there in the pub. But I just thought it was a really weird way to do that in a semi-final, sort of hauling off those players that have been their most threatening so far.
It definitely was. I think the two things I would say is, I felt like, as you say, they were all just tired. And I think Denmark were playing until this game so far and above themselves in terms of like passion and energy put into the game, like putting in the hard yards, that I can imagine that they were just really tired at that point in the tournament. And the second one was, it definitely felt like a last throw of the dice, like a last ditch attempt that didn't have a lot of strategy behind it. There was no real plan B. It was kind of just, I need to shake things up and this is all that I can do right now. So I definitely agree with you that we had more depth, we had more, plans to gears to shift into and things like that.
Yeah, I mean the subs. I mean the subs were still. I mean we've just talked for a long time there about how we like Gareth Southgate now, and all is forgiven Gareth, and you're welcome round mine for tea anytime. The subs still do make me scratch my head sometimes. I mean, again, like we did win the match,
so maybe not anytime. Maybe just on weekends when you're free. If you've got an hour or two, he can come. But you're not going to drop anything.
He can come around any time. I can't promise I'm going to put effort into dinner though. If he keeps taking off Bukayo Saka,
that's fair.
I thought that was a slightly weird sub. I did think, it's maybe me being a little bit harsh because a lot of what Mason Mount does is sometimes hard to quantify, but I didn't think Mason Mount was having the best game. And so when Saka came off ahead of him for Grealish, I thought that was a little bit weird. And then, I just didn't really understand that one. And then sort of Phil Foden coming off for Mason Mount eventually, but so late in the game, just seemed weird to me. And then of course Jack Grealish getting subbed on to get subbed off was hopefully not too much of an ego blow for young Jack, and hopefully he can see the big picture and sort of think that he'll be lifting a Euros trophy in a couple of days, and that makes up for it all. But yeah, that was the one sort of my one, if I'm to be sort of a miserly old man that's sort of going, well, we won, but we didn't win quite the way I'd have liked. That would be my one issue of contention.
Yeah, well, I think the way that I see it is that what happened was very much a tactical shift in extra time, and as you say, what Mason Mount does isn't necessarily immediately obvious, and he was very much leading the press for England and very much helping to keep
off the ball
Denmark
work is fantastic.
And then I think that into extra time, there was a real shift in ideas for England, which is why we really started to dominate the game possession-wise, because he also took off Declan Rice for Jordan Henderson and then Phil Foden for Mason Mount. And in my mind, that's two very solid off-the-ball players for two decent on-the-ball players. And I think that tactical shift then allowed us to go on more of a front foot in search of that goal in the last few minutes when Denmark were really starting to flag. But we're just trying to put men behind the ball. So I do kind of understand that. But I know what you're saying, that, maybe you could have taken off Mount sooner. But I mean, again, it worked, right?
It's just like, we like Mason Mount on this podcast. He's a good player and he's great off the ball. His pressing is great. But it was sort of like, it got to the point in that game, Denmark really started to run out of steam early. And I kind of felt like having Mason Mount on the pitch was like the football equivalent of knocking someone out and then just sitting on their head for good measure. It was like, they're not going anywhere. We don't need this as well.
Maybe throw a punch.
It's like, they're already out cold. You can leave the ring.
Yeah. That's a fair point. I take where you're coming from. I think we probably could have won this game just over 90 minutes if we'd really squeezed the knife deeper. But we won it, and hopefully we weren't too tired in the process of playing that extra 30 minutes. There it is.
I know that this isn't going to be popular for our... Well, I hope that people look at this in a measured and balanced way, but, a lot of our listeners are English. Rupert, was the penalty a penalty or not a penalty for you?
I mean, it's just one of those... I don't really feel like I need to have an opinion on it. Like, he did touch him, and he did
artfully
go down.
sidestepped.
But, like, no... Yes, it was a penalty because he hit him and he went down, and in modern football, that's a penalty. It sometimes doesn't get given, but that's fine. I wouldn't be, for
I
example,
mean,
if it
I'll
wasn't
take it.
if it wasn't given, if it wasn't given, I would obviously be a little upset, but I wouldn't say that we were robbed after 90 minutes.
Yeah, you see, my mind maybe works in a slightly different way than if we weren't given it. Because what I was thinking about with that was I was like, how would I feel if Denmark had won a penalty for the same foul? And I would have been livid. I just, again, in the moment, it was one of those where I was like, I saw there's one angle that looks quite bad from like sort of behind in the left where you could sort of see him get knocked twice. And he is running at speed. So obviously, I don't think he's thrown himself down. You're always going to go down if you get sort of even slightly nudged at that speed. But I didn't think it was a penalty. I think at the end of the day, it's much of a muchness. And I think as much as I would sort of be cursing this out, this is almost sort of like maybe karmic retribution. England have been knocked out of several tournaments for these sort of fine margins that do happen in football. So maybe you could say, you know, it all evens out. And I do think for what it's worth, England were by far the better team. And had it not been this penalty, it could have been another goal. But yeah, I think for my money, it wasn't a penalty. I'll take it. I'll happily take it and run straight to the Euros final. But that was my one thing where I was like, we've slightly got away with one there.
It was funny though, wasn't it? How I don't know. It kind of feels like the Croatia fixture in reverse, really. In 2018, where we played them in the semis. In that, obviously, you know, we went ahead with a free kick early on, and then the other opposition started to dominate, and then eventually won 2-1. But the reason why I don't really care is because Denmark also broke the rules of football during the free kick that they scored, because you're not allowed to have a wall that close to the defender's wall. Both of them maybe might not have happened, so I just kind of think morally they cancel each other out and don't care. I think we earned it.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, really. You know, these things happen in football. I think a lot of people sort of, when a result goes against either them or it goes for a team they don't like, as we've seen, you know, England being like one of the most hated football teams in the world, apparently, sort of everyone sort of becomes like a qualified coach / referee about one incident, and then they would hear your point, you raising that, and they go like, oh, come on, mate, like, it's just the fine margins, blah, 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 and that one they don't see.
Well, yeah, exactly. And like Denmark was so, like, the Denmark press was so like brutal about in their assessment of it, and it's just like, well, if you're gonna open your eyes, open both of them.
That I kind of don't really mind. Like, if the Danish press want to feel really aggrieved about that, I can because in my opinion it wasn't a penalty. I can kind of be like, fair enough. Like, especially the day after or a few days after, like, that's a really like upsetting way to get knocked out of a tournament. The one I have no time for is like other countries. Particularly, like, obviously, like, Scottish fans and Welsh fans and sort of, they always have their axe to grind. But the Italian fans are already going for it, and there's, like, Gazzetta dello Sport, like, had this conspiracy that UEFA gifted us the penalty because Boris Johnson was there, and Boris Johnson was instrumental in shutting down the Super League, so UEFA kind of owe England and Boris Johnson one. That was in Gazzetta dello Sport, which is like the biggest sports publication in Italy. And I was just like, what is this? Also, like, of all teams to be a bit snippy about like referee decisions. Italy, come on now. Firstly, your team this year has very much been employing the Furbo tactic and sort of, you know, stretching out games. And secondly, does Calciopoli ring a bell by any chance?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're going to do what they're going to do, right? It's just, again, I mean, I agree with you. Don't care. They can do what they like. We're still gonna beat them in the final.
Before we go to Italy versus Spain, one last little question / declaration. I love Bukayo Saka. Should he start in the final? Gary Neville thinks no, and I think he's an idiot.
I think that, yeah, we're going to get into the tactics of the final later on, but I think he fits the tactics of the final, so yes.
Okay, that's all I want for now. Just agreeing that Bukayo Saka is love, Bukayo Saka is life. He is going to be the star of the final, score a hat-trick, and we're going to win it.
Maybe the best player ever.
Very, very maybe. Moving into Italy versus Spain. A really interesting one because it did not play out the way I thought it would. I thought that Italy were going to really give Spain a spanking. I think Spain are a team that have rode, not their luck, but like, some people would say that Spain have grown into this tournament because obviously they had a really rocky start and then they scored 10 goals in 2 games and then they sort of got through to the semi-finals. I actually don't know that I agree with that. I think that Spain didn't do very well in the first two games. Then Busquets came back and they started playing players like Azpilicueta at right back, which made sense instead of midfield at right back. And they beat a Slovakia side 5-0, who were very demoralised early on by Dubravka's own goal, and just a bit shocking. The second goal, I think, was also Dubravka Carrera, and sort of did it. And so they sort of just rode that one. Okay, great. Then they beat Croatia, but they let Croatia get back into the game and kind of won that game as a war of attrition. I don't know that if Croatia had a deeper bench and not so many players sort of injured and coronavirus out, that Spain would have managed to finish that game off. They just sort of won it by virtue of being a country with deeper benches. And then they sort of very fortunately got through against Switzerland on penalties, who somehow overnight went from being perfect penalty takers to really, really nervy and took some of the worst penalties I've seen in a long, long time. And then they sort of came to this game, and I was sort of, that was where my head was at. I was like, well, Spain rather, have sort of got here by hook or by crook. And Italy have been one of the most dominant teams in the tournament. They should bash them. And it was anything but. I thought Spain were the better team for most of this match.
They definitely were. I think that the main thing that maybe you're overlooking is like the importance of Busquets for Spain's quality overall, and just the addition of him in midfield allowed them to completely shift how they approach games, how they dominated games, and this game against Italy was a great example of that, because Busquets, Italy have been really good in the midfield at pressing teams and restricting them from playing out. I think they've created the most chances from a high press than any other team in the Euros so far, defined by up to 40 meters away from the opponent's goal. But Busquets in this game was just able to pick up the ball literally anywhere, with as much pressure on him as he liked, and just spray them wide, play it back, keep the fullbacks in play. I think that he just completely changes it for them.
No, I agree. I think Busquets is fantastic. And I think one of the most interesting things about Busquets that is maybe gone a little bit unsung is sort of everyone's talking about how amazing Pedri's been at this tournament. And Pedri is amazing and has been fantastic this tournament. But I think the big part of that has been because Busquets has sort of come in and enabled him to sort of take up a more free role. And just watching Pedri, even without Busquets, amazing just because of his first touch. But yeah, Pedri's definitely even more dynamic with Busquets in that 11. But Busquets was playing against Switzerland, and I wasn't really impressed with Spain against Switzerland. I thought, penalties aren't a complete coin toss, but I thought that they were really helped out by the fact that Switzerland just decided to not take penalties well. I was actually pretty sure, based on Spain's penalty record, they were going to go out at that point, and then Switzerland just decided to throw. And so on the strength of that, I was like, okay, well, they're going to get absolutely walloped by Italy. And instead, Spain really did well. And I think it's interesting you talk about Busquets there, because And so I was sort of mentioning Pedri. This is just Spain through and through. They've been fantastic in the midfield in so many games and dominated this game in the midfield and just ran around Italy, who I think have otherwise had the best midfield of the tournament, just in terms of balance and the style of play and sort of how they sort of have that number 8 joining the attack in some phases, and they're really good at locking things down with a press at other times. It's been really, really impressive to watch. And they just got, Pedri was running rings around Jorginho, which was bizarre to watch. But yet again, as has ever been the case with them, no finishing. Absolutely toothless up front.
Yeah, they really struggled. I mean, they're surely like one good striker away from just dominating this entire competition. But, crucially, they were one striker short of dominating the entire tournament. And I think
but not even like a top, I think good is the word for it. I would like stress good striker rather than like world class. Because do you remember when Spain had that just amazing, very arguably, I would sort of go for one of the Brazil sides, but arguably the best sort of international team of all time when they sort of won Euros, World Cup Euros. Sure. And they had up front, like their striker was David Villa. And sometimes they didn't even play him. And David Villa was obviously a good player, but he wasn't like the sort of the Harry Kane or the Lewandowski of his day. I think Spain literally just needs someone who can reliably finish, because half the time the chances are really good.
Well, David Villa was a very good player. Let's not rewrite that. But I know what you mean. He's not.
No, he was, but he wasn't. He was never top 3.
5. Yeah. Okay. Sure.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, so a couple of collected opinions on all of that. I kind of feel like Switzerland against Spain had a game similar to England versus Denmark, which was that they had to go absolutely all out to stay in this game, and they did. but it left them just absolutely shattered by the time it got to crunch time, which for Denmark was when they struggled during extra time, and for Switzerland was when they literally just couldn't take a penalty to save their life. I think that they put so much energy into that game against Spain that they were able to keep them at bay, but then it also led to them, crucially, like being unable to finish the job. I think that the other part of it is the Spain versus Italy game. I actually feel like their strikers, which are Dani Olmo and then later Alvaro Morata, played a really important role in allowing Spain to break down Italy effectively, because they were kind of dropping into the midfield and helping overload, which then allowed Spain to play through the midfield and then turn and push them wide and attack from there. So I think that it would have expected a lot of any player to have been able to do that and then also to finish the moves. And I think that they maybe could have started a more direct threat, but you would have lost that ability to dominate the midfield as a result.
I agree, and I think that you've made a very good point there. I was really impressed with Dani Olmo in terms of what he was able to do. He was dancing around a lot of the Italian players, and they did look really dominant in the midfield, but not to put too fine a point on it. But football is a game where you have to put the ball in the net more times than the other team does. So it's all well and good to dominate the midfield. If you're not getting any goals for it, you're not going to win the game.
True. But I do think, Spain definitely could have scored more than they did. And again, that's a dumb thing to say. But all it takes is one or two of them to go in, and on another day, they could have done.
Yeah, very possibly. I just feel like, I feel like we've been over this already with Mr. Josep Guardiola in the Champions League final. Why are we eschewing this long-honoured tradition of playing strikers? And I maybe get it for Spain because their strikers have been really, really bad, but it just seemed weird that Luis Enrique has put all of his faith in Morata for like the whole tournament. And then in this game, he was like, you know what, Alvaro? Not today. Incidentally,
I was wrong.
It did. Well, incidentally, maybe that's why it sort of paid off. And Morata's goal was really, really good as well. It was basically like a sort of magic solo goal, except obviously he sort of made that pass. But the move was fantastic. The pass was fantastic. Took it really well. Donnarumma was sort of a little bit weird in his sort of timing, but it was from very close range and a very cool finish. It was also one of those where, like, as soon as he scored that, I and everyone I was watching it with, and I kind of feel like everyone who was watching it worldwide was like, oh no, he scored that, he's going to miss his penalty.
Yeah, fair. And miss a penalty he did. He does just feel like one of those players that is never quite going to catch a break.
It does feel that way, doesn't it? I mean, the tournament has been... It's been such a weird tournament of up and downs for him, because, like, on the one hand, he has been not solely responsible, but largely responsible for a lot of Spain's shortcomings this tournament. But on the other hand, he's now their all-time top scorer at the Euros. He's got 6 goals. He's scored a really, really nice goal against Croatia. He's scored a really, really nice goal here. It's just like, he's one of those players, if he could just do the stuff that he does well. Some players you look at and you go, you can't do anything right. With Morata, it's kind of frustrating because you go, you can actually do this really well 10% of the time.
Well, it's like the Granit Xhaka conundrum, isn't it? It's like
great similar example. Yeah,
you're exceptional, but 1 game in 15.
Yeah, do it more often. But like Morata's like 15 minutes in a game, and you're like, if you could just knuckle down and just, because you have the talent, you have the ability to do that, and there's a lot of the rest of your game that's impressive as well, even when you're not scoring goals. If you could just get that, because how does a player go from like missing chance from 5 yards out to like volleying it into the roof of the goal like he did against Croatia? How can you not do one and then do the other?
Well, it's one of those things where it has to come back to mentality and ability to stay focused on the pitch, and it's such a skill. And obviously you look at someone like Morata's career and you can tell why these massive clubs have always taken interest in him, like Real Madrid and then Chelsea and then Juventus, because he has these incredible flashes of brilliance. And I can imagine any number of managers thinking like exactly what you thought. If I can only get that out of him, squeeze that good juice out of him at all times, then I've got an absolutely world-class player on my hands. But he just is consistently showing that he can't quite do it. And if he's not going to do it for Spain in an international tournament every game, then he's just not really going to ever do it. Sorry, Alvaro.
No, definitely true. But like you said, I would not be surprised at all if once his number is up at Juventus, whether it's a sale or his contract runs out, I wouldn't be surprised to see him get a move to another decent sized club. Because I could see a manager sort of sitting there and being like, it's a gamble, but the the reward could be hefty if I can just figure it out. I thought that Chiesa again was fantastic on the Italian side of things. I thought he was absolutely fantastic this game. He's been a player that maybe some were surprised not to see initially because he has had such a good season for Juventus in a season that was otherwise a bit forgettable for them, but has sort of made his way into the team and just scored so many lovely goals. But I did think for Italy, the big miss for them, and this is another thing that we'll be looking at in a second at the final, is they looked a lot weaker without Spinazzola on the side. And it seems weird to say of a left-back, although maybe less weird now that everyone's watched a month of Euros football where apparently left-backs have become the most impactful position on the field. They really looked like they were lacking in midfield because Spinazzola likes to push up. Coming down the wings, they were really, really dangerous. It really underlined something I think we all knew already, is sort of like how important he is. He's always all over the pitch. And it was sort of like, when Chelsea got Kante back at the end of the season, and you were like, oh God, I forgot that when you have this guy on the pitch, it's like having 2 or 3 extra players. And Italy did at times in this game look like they were a man down just by not having Spinazzola, because they're used to playing with 12 men, and this time, Emerson just counts as 1.
Yeah, they're really going to struggle without him. And I mean, I don't think it's surprising that kind of a left wing back position is so impactful, because in formations like Italy's, they're responsible for a lot of the balance between defence and attack. And having someone who's able to just eat up the yards and do both really effectively and provide a constant outlet while locking down one flank from the opposition is just completely crucial to being able to mount a good offence and defence.
They are, but traditional wisdom would tell you, and just logically it would make sense, that a fullback that is always raiding up the flanks is likely to get caught out at the back. And conversely, a fullback that is really locked down at the back and sort of great at sitting back is not going to be as creative going forwards. It's sort of like the Alexander Arnold versus Wan-Bissaka argument. One is a fantastic defensive fullback, but you're not going to expect him to make a lot of assists. The other is going to bomb up, get a few assists, maybe even score a goal or two, but every now and again he's going to get caught out of position. And what's weird at this tournament is we've seen a number of players, from Denzel Dumfries to Spinazzola to Joaquin Mahler, who have sort of found this weird ability to sort of just be in 2 places at once, because they do both raid up the flanks and join these attacks and even sometimes play on the opposite wing. And then the other team gets the ball, and you're kind of like, right, well, from all of the games of football I've watched and how I know time and human bodies work, the left side is now going to be exposed. And then you sort of look up and you're like, what?
It's funny, Joaquin Mahler just rocks up on the right flank and bangs it in, and you're like, what? Where?
That's what I mean. They're as far on the pitch as they possibly could be from their designated position, and they don't get punished for it.
It does seem to defy belief. Obviously, England doesn't have anyone quite on the level of someone like a Joaquin Mahler in terms of impact on a game. I mean, Luke Shaw is the most obvious example, but do you think that England's fullbacks fall into that category?
Yeah, well, I think Luke Shaw has been tremendous. I think the difference between someone like Luke Shaw and some of the other players we've mentioned is that Luke Shaw has, I mean, first and foremost, you don't really see Luke Shaw on the right wing, which is something I'm happy about, because I still can't get my head wrapped around it. Even though all these players do end up covering themselves, it still makes me anxious on their behalf, because I'm like, you're not supposed to be there, you're a left back. I think Luke Shaw's been great. I don't think he's quite the same style. I don't really think any of England's fullbacks are. I think when we talked about England versus Germany, the closest player we have who would fulfill that role would have been Bukayo Saka, because obviously he has played as a left back and also as a left winger and also as a right winger. So he does sort of have the ability to play on all those positions. Whether he would have the ability to play on all those positions at once, as someone like Spinazzola does, I guess we'll have to wait and find out.
Well, there's only one way to find out. Maybe not the final. Maybe the final isn't the time to do that though.
A bit much. Let's wrap up this game the way that it wrapped up on the penalties, because of course we've talked about how Alvaro Morata took the fourth for Spain and missed his, which teed up Italy to win it. But that was only a tiny part of what was a really, really exciting and bizarre and humorous series of events that happened over the course of the penalties. Obviously, wrapping up with Jorginho's penalty that was just unbelievably cool. Just
it was
such
one
a
of
good
the
penalty.
most satisfying penalties I've ever seen in my life. Obviously, like it's so nice to watch someone absolutely slot it in the top bins like Bernardeschi did, but that surely, penalty of the tournament for sure.
You just don't, because the thing about slotting at top bins is you see that and you go, oh, good pen, always taking that well. That one, again, I think I've talked before about like the involuntary noise that some goals make you make, and like that one, it was definitely like a, ooh, like just a, oh, I can't believe he's pulled that one off.
True. I mean, okay, not to play the party pooper, but I don't feel like Unai Simon did a single shred of research onto Jorginho's penalties, because
No.
if he had, I think he has a good chance of saving that. So I don't want to just pull the rug out from under Jorginho's big moment, but I mean, come on. You've got to look at how people take their penalties, and the way that he goes early was just so easy for Jorginho to do what he did. If anything, I think that Thiago Alcantara's penalty was more impressive. He kind of did exactly the same thing in that he did a little bit of a skip, kept his eyes on the keeper, but his hit was way more firmly just put in the bottom corner.
Yeah, well, it's just like, why dive early for that kind of penalty taker? It's just, I don't know, it didn't make sense. But that was how it ended. I also thought it was one of those where you kind of knew who was going to win before anyone had taken a penalty, because the whole sort of Chiellini-Alba thing beforehand. I was watching that and I was like, oh, this is big dick energy right here. This is like big dick energy in footballer form. He's absolutely like just taking the piss out of him. Jordi Alba did not look happy about the way things are going, and Chiellini was laughing. And I was sort of like, if you're a player for either team, if you're the Italian team and you're looking at Chiellini, basically, I saw someone describing it to like when like you're in school and it was like when a year 13 like comes over and it's like sort of messing around with you and you're like, ha, but you're really scared. And that's it looked like partly because of the physical size, but also just like of the sort of like jovial piss taking and the little sort of like not punch to the face, but like sort of, I don't even know what you would call that, because punching sounds too aggressive, but just sort of like knocking him and just be like, hey, and then Jordi Alba not liking it. I was like, oh god. Yeah, joshing around. I was like, all the Spanish players are going to be looking at it and just being like, don't let him bully you, Jordi.
I mean, and Jordi very much looked like he got bullied. I know what you mean. It was kind of like that moment where you're like, yeah, we have the psychological advantage going into it, and psychology is everything.
Yeah, 100% it was. Shall we move into useless trivia before we do a quick preview for the final?
Yeah, let's. I think I've definitely saved some of the analysis of that game, because I want to talk about how Spain broke down Italy. And how we can try and do the same. But let's do useless trivia first. And I have an interesting little piece of knowledge for you today. You may or may not have seen it. But did you know that in this final on Sunday, Italy's manager Roberto Mancini will be just the second manager to have won the English top flight title to take charge of a European nation in a major tournament final, so the World Cup or the Euros. The first one, you ask? Alf Ramsey in 1966.
Well, I have to match your useless trivia about Roberto Mancini with an even more piece of useless trivia about Roberto Mancini, and that is that he is the only manager in football history to have beaten both Luis Enrique and Tony Pulis at Wembley.
A giant statistic that really speaks to the width and breadth of his career.
Most people, when they think of Spanish Tony Pulis, tend to think about Mikel Arteta, but maybe it's Luis Enrique.
I think Tony Pulis is Spanish Tony Pulis. Tony Pulis exists in all forms, in all countries, as himself.
Looking last and certainly not least at our preview for the final, the big event, the culmination of this entire tournament, and indeed the culmination of 55 years of dreaming for England fans and the England team. Italy versus England. Rupert, where should we start with this one?
What an introduction that was. Let's start with our initial sense of how this is going to go, just in terms of like, are you feeling confident? Are you feeling nervous? A little bit of both. Where's your head at?
As an England fan, I always just start the tournament extremely pessimistic. There's always like a little kernel of me that's like, we're out in the groups. And then the better we do, I sort of like am reservedly feeling better and better. And I'm like, okay, well, keep it in check, keep it in check. I've given in. I've given in to England mania now. And I'm fully confident that we're going to win this final. That will only worsen my disappointment if we don't. But I believe now. I really do think that England have looked really, really strong this tournament. There were some shortcomings earlier on in terms of sort of looking a bit dull, but I think the Ukraine game showed that they know how to switch it on. I think the Germany game showed that the team, as well as the manager, know how to play differently against different styles. They're not going to be caught out by a team playing something they're not used to. And I think they know how to manage out games, as we saw against Denmark. So everything that we've seen from the tournament, from the team in this tournament, after each stage has sort of like, it's almost built up a CV, of what they can do. And I think they are worthy applicants for the role of champions.
Yeah, I would kind of agree with that as like a progression. And I want to pretend at least that it's not just giving in to kind of England mania. I do feel like at first very apprehensive about Italy, the strength of the side, how good they've looked. But then the more you start to look at, the tactics behind the sides, I actually think we might be quite well suited for this game. Call me crazy.
I think the midfield battle is going to be absolutely enormous. Obviously, Ukraine, Italy have had probably the best organised midfield at the tournament, but we saw in the last game how they can be overrun in midfield. It's not like they're unbeatable. Whereas England have only conceded 1 goal this tournament. The double pivots have played really well, if a little bit, unexciting in a few games, but it has sort of worked quite well. And I think Italy, unlike England, have been a little bit more of a one-trick pony. I think you mentioned, obviously, yes, they did have that game against Wales where they rotated, but I think the fact that they've gone for one starting 11 for the vast majority of this tournament, barring, I think the Berardi-Chiesa one is the major one, and Verratti, but he wasn't left out for tactical reasons, it was injury. I think that Gareth Southgate is going to have a pretty good idea of what team Italy are going to come to this final with, whereas I don't know that Mancini is going to know what 11 England are going to turn up with. I certainly don't. It could be the exact same one as we brought against Denmark, which is of itself sort of only a slight alteration against Ukraine, but it could be completely different because we have shown the ability to play different players, play different styles. A lot of people think Foden might come in. Gary Neville thinks that every player who plays for Manchester United should play there, whether they're English or not.
Which I was really surprised by, actually.
Yeah, it was crazy, wasn't it? He keeps doing it. He keeps like listing all these English players, and then like he'll try and slip Marcus Rashford in. And Marcus Rashford's a great lad, and he's a good footballer. But it's like sometimes, like Gary Neville will always do this. He'll talk about all these young English talents, and he'll be like, "Yeah, like England, they've got all these fantastic young talents. Foden, Saka, Grealish, Rashford." And I'm like, "Oh, hold up! You've tried to bring something in here that you're not allowed to. Leave that at the door."
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Well, I don't know where where the lies started, because I mean I'm pretty sure he put Marcus Rashford in his team of the season for the Premier League. So I mean, if he believes that,
honestly,
then
mate.
he believes. I can imagine that he would believe that he should be starting. But yeah, I agree with you. We definitely have a little bit more tactical flexibility, and it will be a real blow, as you said, to be without Spinazzola. But I was looking at Spain's game against Italy and the way that they won the midfield battle, and a couple of things came out of it. The first is that it's obviously going to be quite hard to do that without Sergio Busquets or even a player like Pedri, because we've got midfielders that are good on the ball, but we don't have anyone quite of that ilk that can really just pick up the ball anywhere, and you can look at him do it with 100% confidence and think, I back this guy to get out of any situation. But there are similarities, I would say, with how Spain played and how we've played up until now and how we can play. The first related to, as I kind of mentioned, with Dani Olmo and Alvaro Morata dropping deeper to pick up possession and helping overload the midfield numbers. I think obviously that worked really well for them. It's how they scored their goal, was Morata picking it up deeper, playing a 1-2, and then hitting that Italy backline, who are quite old, at some pace. Which perhaps, maybe someone like Harry Kane doesn't quite have, but he definitely has the ability to drop deep and not only help in midfield, but also create space for the two wingers to operate in those half spaces between the opposition's midfield and defence. And the other way is with Spain's use of fullbacks and wingers. And they had quite an interesting system, which was that for the most part, they had their wingers, when in possession, even in their own half, stay incredibly wide. And what that meant was that their fullbacks were able to also play quite deep and constantly offer an outlet. And obviously, we've kind of, against Denmark, for example, adopted slightly different tactics. We've tended to push our fullbacks wide and high, and that allows players like Sterling and Saka to drop in into the midfield. But I think that we could, slightly adapt those tactics, keep Sterling wide, and have confidence in our fullbacks' ability to play the same roles as Spain's fullbacks. But also, I think the way that we operate creates similar kind of overloads in midfield by having Sterling and Saka playing, more centrally and them playing wider. And I also think, obviously we've talked about it to death almost, Harry Kane dropping deep. It might actually be a good thing this game, dare I say it?
Yeah, well, the reason that I'm sort of I have like PTSD about Harry Kane dropping deep, but the reason I'm sort of inclined to agree with you more specifically about sort of Sterling and Saka coming centrally is that I think that despite Harry Kane's recent vein of good form, I just think that Kane versus Chiellini is a horrible matchup. It's happened before in the past, and he's bodied not only Harry Kane, but Harry Kane's club. With the history of the Tottenham thing. Chiellini, I think, just as a matchup for Harry Kane, even though he's old, he's got a good bit of pace for a centre-back. He's extremely physical, and I just think there are certain qualities that you could maybe use to take advantage of Chiellini's, slightly larger frame, and the fact that he does have pace for a centre-back, but it's pace for a centre-back. I think Raheem Sterling is poised to give him a lot more trouble than Harry Kane. I think Harry Kane will easily be pocketed by Chiellini if he's in the right mood on Sunday. So I think in that regard, I would rather those players sort of coming in centrally with Harry Kane dropping back a bit.
Yeah, that makes total sense, and I agree with you. I think Chiellini kind of, he's like an anti-Kane. He kind of just negates him in play.
Kind of.
But, if Kane removes himself from that battle, then he won't get drawn into it. And I agree with you that, those inverted or kind of like slightly more inward-facing wingers being able to hit Italy's backline with pace and maybe playing off Kane with 1-2s is going to really, provide some attacking options for us. I think the other way that we look to shape up against Denmark, which might work quite well against Italy, is in the way that Declan Rice kind of sat quite deep, and then both Calvin Phillips and Mason Mount at times would also look to push on into the attacking phase and the final third, and that again, like operating in those like slightly inside channels, both between those two midfielders and then Sterling and Saka, that finding that balance is going to be, in my opinion at least, key to, us being able to create chances.
Yeah, well, I'm going to sound like a broken record here because I'm pretty sure I've said this in every single episode since the Euros started. But this is why I'd start Jack Grealish, because I really liked against Czech Republic in the groups how even when Harry Kane was dropping back, it was almost like the two of them were switching places. And I really like the idea of, especially because I think Chiellini's going to be given a brief before this game, which is basically like, stop Harry Kane. And I think that's, what he should be told to do because he can do it perfectly. He's the anti-Kane basically in their team. What I think is interesting about that is it provides an opportunity to sort of play, if you know that that's going to happen, you can play around it. Taking from what you were saying about Spain playing with wingers really tight to the touchline, I think you could take a huge advantage, especially if you have someone like Luke Shaw sort of running up to join. You can have the wingers tight to the touchline, that's going to stretch the back four, and then if you have someone like Jack Grealish who's getting a bit forwards as Harry Kane drops back, there's going to be spaces in that back four, especially with Chiellini sort of maybe being drawn out a little bit to Harry Kane, and you can just break through the lines, Saka or Sterling coming in behind, and that's a great chance there, in theory. So I think if we have those players, and it depends who we start on the wing, obviously Sterling will definitely start. It'll depend if it's sort of like Sancho or Saka or Foden, but I think all of them have that ability, and are left-footed as well, so a great cutting in from that right. I think Jadon Sancho is left-footed. I might be wrong about Foden or Saka. All right, so Saka or Foden then would sort of be the better option cutting in that side. But then, if Sancho is the player there, he could then cut it back. Although, again, I wouldn't really want to cut it back against Chiellini and Bonucci. They don't let a lot of stuff go loose. But yeah, Saka or Foden coming in behind there to a Jack Grealish pass once the defenders have been stretched a little bit and you can break the lines would be a really good opportunity, and I think is sort of your best representation of doing that, especially because it's going to be Emerson on that left side who is the weakest component of that back four at the moment.
Yeah, he definitely is. So do you think you would start Jack Grealish over Mason Mount, as we talked about?
Yeah, probably. I mean, if I were to really put on my mad cam hat and say what I really wanted to go for, I would
your pet bald cap.
Yeah, my pet, the swimming cap that I've painted skin coloured so I can feel like Pep Guardiola. I would sort of finally try and go for the nebulous idea of a defensive midfielder and dual free eights with Mason Mount and Jack Grealish, and sort of have Mason Mount playing in the way that he played against Denmark, sort of less attacking commitments, pressing well off the ball, commitments, and then Jack Grealish sort of having the ability to break the lines. I would be loath, as much as I really still don't like it, it's got us to a final, to drop the double pivots, though. I just think that that's what Gareth Southgate's going to go for. If it were me, and this is perhaps why I'm not an international manager or a manager at all, I would go, right, balls to the wall. Italy are going to be huge in midfield.
Yeah.
Let's absolutely go at them. And sort of instead of being static in the midfield with two blockers, let's go for one dedicated blocker who's been fantastic this tournament in Calvin Phillips, and have free eights. And that means that Mason Mount can just run after Barella the entire game, just basically like tie their shoelaces together so that every time Barella's anywhere, Mason Mount is in his shadow. And, Jack Grealish can come forwards and make those passes. I don't think that's what we will do, but Southgate surprised me before.
He constantly surprised us, but I actually disagree with you there. I think we'll get overrun in midfield if we don't have that strength of the double pivot that has gotten us as far as it has. And I think it's so integral to our game plan, which is also just to kind of sit other teams out and like just wear them down, but be really defensively solid. I think that against Italy, we're really going to need that defensive solidity, because if we don't have a really physical midfield, a dynamic midfield that can press and defend really well, then I think we're getting overrun.
You see, I would have agreed with you, and I think part of this, to be fair, it's kind of like when we talked about, like, you don't have a Kante, we don't have a Busquets. I would have agreed with you until I saw the Spain game, and it's kind of like one of those, not attack is the best form of defence, but, like, I think if you sit back against that Italian midfield, like a lot of teams have this tournament, you're kind of asking for them to overrun if you're giving them time on the ball. I think if you have sort of a player like Mason Mount, who can absolutely get forwards and play a sort of defence-splitting pass, but equally can press really well and just cause someone like Verratti to, every time Verratti steps forwards to sort of try and drift a little bit, north of his usual position, he's going to be thinking, right, am I going to get an absolutely crunching tackle from Calvin Phillips, or is someone going to dispossess me and then Mason Mount is going to be able to shuttle it forwards? So yeah, I again, mad manager cap idea. This is maybe the reason why I'm not a manager. I would sort of gamble it all and go for the free eights.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, I kind of know what you mean in that Spain really dominated possession. I think they had 65% possession, which is the first time anyone's done that to Italy this tournament, and it also worked. So I hear what you're saying, but it makes me very nervous.
It makes me nervous as well, and I'm the one proposing it.
Well, I mean, it would be fun, wouldn't it? I'd love to see that kind of confidence to really start the game on the front foot, but I could also imagine that would be a really nice tactical shift later in the game, like we did against Denmark, where we brought on Jordan Henderson and we brought on Phil Foden to change the game. So I could really see, Jack Grealish being an amazing impact sub to come on and do exactly what you've just said, when Italy may be tiring because or maybe Italy are looking like they have slightly less, dynamism to them without Spinazzola.
Yeah, for sure. I also really like, we've talked about how we want to play when we have the ball and sort of even if we're off the ball, but sort of in their half. I also think defensively we're a good matchup as well. I think the fact that we're going to have Luke Shaw on Chiesa really settles my stomach. Otherwise, I'd sort of be, squatting over in pain about the idea of Chiesa running at our back line. But I think Luke Shaw and him is a really good matchup. I really like the fact that we've got Harry Maguire on Ciro Immobile. Ciro Immobile isn't particularly slow, but he's not the paciest forward. And I think Harry Maguire is well suited to play him out of the game if he continues to play as well as he has so far this tournament. And I think Jordan Pickford has been really, really good this tournament. So unless they get a good, clear-cut chance, I don't think they're going to be able to get away with some of the goals they've been scoring this tournament, where it's just sort of like a moment of brilliance and they've just had a crack and the keeper's been sort of half asleep. I hope that I am not now jinxing that by saying it, touch wood.
Yeah, I think you're right about those players. I could see Lorenzo Insigne being a little bit dangerous just because he can play wide, he can come in. I don't think we have as much of a natural defence to him. And he can really pick up the ball and go with it. But if someone like Declan Rice is doing his job well, hopefully he won't have too much space to cut in.
Yeah, and also, on the right side of defence, we're going to have Kyle Walker, who can tuck inside, and he can sort of, much like Insigne in sort of a mirror match there, when Insigne is playing out wide, Kyle Walker can stick out wide. When he's coming inside, Kyle Walker can shift in a little bit, especially because, again, Emerson may well try and overlap on that left-hand side, but not only does that provide an attacking opportunity for England, but he's just nowhere near as good at it as Spinazzola. I think Spinazzola has been Italy's best player at this tournament. I think he arguably has a shout for player of the tournament. So the fact that Italy are going to this game without him is enormous for England.
Yeah, agreed. Just one of the many reasons why you can be confident that England have a very decent chance at winning this game.
So it's not come home yet, but is it fair to say that it's booked the tickets and it's sat in the departure lounge? And it may, the flight may be cancelled. That may happen on Sunday. But do you think that's fair to say, that it's in the departure lounge?
I think that it's he on its way to the gate. The football is like rolling down the the
rolling
sides.
to the gate.
Exactly. Yeah, that's how I would put it. Hasn't quite grabbed its coffee for the trip. Might well pop by in like a WH Smith on the way through, but it's getting there.
I'm glad we both feel very confident, and that is probably a good place to wrap things up. Rupert, great to talk to you as always.
Cam, thank you very much, and I'll see you on the other side.
See you all on the other side. Thanks for listening, guys. Cheers. Armchair Analyst was recorded remotely by Cameron MacDonald and Rupert Meadows. The album artwork was provided by our good friend Amshel.